Hollywood's golden age sparkled with glamour, secrets, and scandals. But behind the velvet curtains and studio spotlights were women whose sexuality both terrified and titillated an industry run by men. Branded nymphomaniacs by tabloid journalists and studio bosses alike, these 15 actresses were accused, sometimes falsely, sometimes proudly, of having insatiable appetites. This isn't just gossip. This is what old Hollywood tried to bury. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead didn't just break the rules. She set fire to the rulebook and tossed it out the window. With her deep Southern drawl, biting wit, and devil-may-care attitude, she stormed onto Broadway and Hollywood screens with a boldness that terrified studios. But behind that sultry voice was a woman who openly embraced her sexual freedom in an era that demanded silence from women. She once quipped, "My only regret in life is that I didn't have more sex." And she meant it. Bankhead was famously fluid in her tastes. Men, women, young actors, politicians, and even fellow actresses were all fair game. She propositioned lovers with the same energy she brought to the stage, her charm irresistible, and her self-destruction just as legendary. Her voracious desires became both her allure and her curse. Whispers about orgies, public nudity, and secret lesbian affairs ran rampant in the tabloids. Studio bosses feared she'd spark moral outrage, and producers blacklisted her for major roles. Still, she refused to be ashamed. Her openness about her appetite led many to label her a nympho, a term laced with both fascination and fear. Bankhead's sexual boldness wasn't a performance, it was survival. Beneath her wildness was a woman struggling with addiction, mental health battles, and the loneliness of being too much for a society that wanted women to be less. She was brave in ways few dared to be, especially in a time when one wrong whisper could destroy your career. She once said, "I'll come and make love to you at 5 o'clock. If I'm late, start without me." That quote wasn't just about sex. It was about a life lived on her own terms, even if it burned everything down along the way. For Tallulah, being branded a nymphomaniac wasn't an insult. It was a battle cry. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner wasn't just a bombshell. She was a tempest in heels. Born in rural North Carolina, she rose from humble roots to become one of the most desired women in Hollywood. But while studios tried to mold her into a lady, Ava refused to be tame. She loved fiercely, drank heavily, cursed like a sailor, and followed her desires wherever they led. She had 3 high-profile marriages to Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, and Frank Sinatra, but they were only the tip of her legendary romantic iceberg. From bullfighters in Spain to tycoons like Howard Hughes, Ava never hid her appetite for men, passion, or pleasure. She openly admitted to cheating, sometimes out of boredom, sometimes out of revenge. Once, when asked about her love life, she famously said, "I'm not a nice girl, I'm a hell of a woman." Her fiery relationship with Sinatra was the stuff of legends. They fought, drank, broke things, and always ended up back in each other's arms, or beds. Studio heads were horrified by her antics, labeling her uncontrollable. Behind closed doors, gossip columnists whispered that Ava had an unquenchable sexual hunger. Hollywood called her a nymphomaniac, but what they feared was a woman who didn't ask permission. But Ava wasn't reckless. She was real. She once said, "Deep down, I'm pretty superficial," but those who knew her knew better. Her drive came from a place of rebellion, of survival, of refusing to live under someone else's rules. And though age and alcoholism would eventually dim her star, she never apologized for who she was. Ava Gardner lived, loved, and lusted without shame. Mae West. Before Madonna, before Marilyn, there was Mae West, the original sexual provocateur of Hollywood. She didn't just play with innuendo, she weaponized it. With lines like, "Why don't you come up and see me sometime?" And "Too much of a good thing can be wonderful." Mae built an empire on pleasure and unapologetic sexuality. What many didn't know was that Mae was just as audacious off-screen. She wrote her own plays and films, often inserting her bold views on sex and power into scripts. She believed sex was natural, and any attempt to shame it was societal repression. Mae had lovers decades younger than her, dancers, gangsters, and even bodybuilders. She surrounded herself with male energy and picked her partners like casting choices, based on performance. Hollywood labeled her a nympho, sometimes affectionately, sometimes cruelly. Her sexual confidence was so shocking that she was even jailed in 1927 for her play Sex. Instead of hiding, she used the arrest to boost her fame. In the bedroom, she reportedly kept a roster and often claimed she never slept alone. But her relationships weren't reckless. They were calculated. She once said, "Love conquers all things except poverty and toothache." Mae West never married, never bore children, and never shrank herself to fit into society's expectations. She remained sexual into her 80s, still appearing in films wearing sequins and surrounded by shirtless men. To call her a nymphomaniac is to simplify a woman who was a master of her own myth. Mae didn't need anyone's approval, just a spotlight and a punchline. Hedy Lamarr. To the world, Hedy Lamarr was the most beautiful woman alive. But behind the stunning face was a restless mind and a heart that searched endlessly for connection through physical intimacy. Hedy had 6 husbands and countless lovers, each one unable to fully hold her. Her beauty trapped her in a role she never asked for, so she sought freedom in love affairs that defied Hollywood's moral standards. A former Austrian aristocrat, Lamar's early exposure to wealth and control left her hungry for power in her own life. Her escape to Hollywood was fueled by more than just ambition. It was survival. She was married off young to a domineering arms dealer and fled the marriage by dressing as a maid and fleeing through the night. That trauma set the tone for her turbulent love life. Once in Hollywood, Hedy turned heads instantly, but the studio system treated her like a silent sculpture. Frustrated, she sought excitement in bed rather than on screen. Lovers included actors, composers, tycoons, even suspected Nazi sympathizers. The tabloids couldn't get enough. Some insiders claimed Hedy used sex like others used cigarettes, habitually and without emotion. But behind those salacious headlines was a woman craving intimacy. Hedy's mind, which helped invent frequency-hopping technology now used in Wi-Fi, was never taken seriously by Hollywood. Rejected intellectually, she turned to physical validation. Was she a nympho, or just a woman searching for something real in a world of illusions? In later years, Lamarr became reclusive, scarred by plastic surgeries and broken dreams. But her story is a reminder that even the most dazzling beauty can hide deep longing and a mind that refused to sit quietly. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford wasn't just a star, she was an empire. Her intense ambition, piercing eyes, and unrelenting will carved her name into Hollywood history. But beneath the polished exterior of shoulder pads and red lipstick was a woman whose private desires defied the era's limits. Crawford didn't just crave success, she craved attention, affection, and, as many insiders claimed, sex in its most compulsive forms. Her early years were marked by struggle and survival. Born into poverty and abandonment, she clawed her way into the chorus line and then onto the silver screen. Along the way, sex became both a tool and an escape. Hollywood insiders whispered about Joan's open-door policy at her home, where producers, actors, and delivery boys allegedly received more than just small talk. Even her marriages, 4 in total, were riddled with rumors of infidelity, insatiable appetite, and sexual mismatches. Her union with Franchot Tone was said to be fraught with jealousy and control, while later lovers complained that Joan's desires were relentless. In the rigid morality of 1940s, Hollywood's such openness wasn't just frowned upon, it was pathologized. Crawford was frequently branded as a nymphomaniac behind the scenes, a label some say MGM used to excuse blacklisting her during contract disputes. But Joan didn't care. She pursued younger men in her later years and allegedly held private viewings of adult films in her home. Several sources claimed she kept explicit photographs hidden in her dressing room, while others insisted she had affairs with both men and women, including actresses. Some even accused her of sexual manipulation, using pleasure as currency in an industry of power. Crawford, however, never confirmed these whispers. Instead, she presented a face of icy control to the public, keeping her passions buried beneath the surface, except in her most intense screen performances. That's where her real hunger burned through. Rita Hayworth. To millions, she was the goddess of desire, the red-haired siren who electrified screens with a single hair flip in Gilda. But for Rita Hayworth, desire came with a heavy cost. Born Margarita Cancino, she was sexualized from an early age, dancing with her father in sultry nightclubs by the time she was a teen. That early objectification would haunt her relationships for life. As her fame exploded, so did her reputation. Behind the glamour, Rita was emotionally fragile, deeply insecure, and chronically unsatisfied. She married 5 times, including to Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan, and still never found peace. The press called her unlucky in love. Hollywood insiders whispered something more brutal, that Rita was addicted to men, incapable of being alone for even a night. Her affairs became tabloid fodder, ranging from co-stars to royals, each ending in heartbreak or betrayal. Wells once claimed she had a childlike need for affection, while others labeled her a compulsive romantic who mistook lust for love. It's said that she often used sex to soothe her inner chaos, a symptom, some claimed, of emotional damage and self-worth issues. When Prince Ali Khan divorced her, citing neglect and instability, it wasn't just a blow to her image. It marked the beginning of her downfall. Studio bosses grew frustrated, claiming Rita was too distracted by men to focus on work. Once praised for her sensual mystique, she was now labeled difficult, erratic, and yes, even a nymphomaniac in hushed studio memos. Rita once lamented, "Men go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with me." Her tragedy wasn't in her appetite, but in being desired for an image rather than being loved for who she was. Hollywood gave her fame, but it never gave her peace. Jean Harlow. Before Marilyn Monroe, there was Jean Harlow, the original blonde bombshell. She exploded onto the screen with raw sexuality, cheeky confidence, and a giggle that made studio executives nervous. But Harlow's appeal didn't end at the camera lens. Her off-screen life was just as provocative, filled with passionate affairs, quickie marriages, and an unfiltered embrace of her sexuality. She was married 3 times before her tragic death at 26, and her romantic life moved at lightning speed. Her second husband, producer Paul Byrne, died under mysterious circumstances, rumored to be a suicide tied to their troubled sex life. Some speculated that Byrne couldn't satisfy her, and insiders hinted that Harlow's needs had driven him to despair. The scandal rocked MGM, and studio fixers scrambled to bury the story. But Jean didn't stop. She reportedly had flings with Spencer Tracy, Clark Gable, and several married men. Rumors flew about her partying, her lingerie-free habits, and even affairs with women. She once said, "I like to wake up in strange beds," a quip that only fueled her image as Hollywood's youngest nympho. Yet her life wasn't just hedonism. Jean suffered from kidney disease, isolation, and the pressure of being every man's fantasy while still being treated like a child. She was frequently overworked, underprotected, and cast in roles that mirrored her real-life objectification. In the public eye, Harlow was a glowing goddess of desire. Behind the scenes, she was a restless spirit searching for love in all the wrong places. Her untimely death only added to the legend and left many wondering what might have been had she lived past the age of 26. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton was the cautionary tale Hollywood never wanted to tell. She entered the film industry like a firecracker, blonde, brash, and bursting with sexual charisma. But her meteoric rise was quickly eclipsed by scandal, addiction, and a self-destructive pattern of seeking love through physical validation. Payton became infamous not just for her roles, but for her love triangle with actor Franchot Tone and tough guy star Tom Neal. The violent fallout, Neal beat Tone into a coma, made headlines nationwide. But Barbara's role in the chaos was what drew the ire of the press. She wasn't portrayed as a victim of domestic violence. She was painted as a nymphomaniac who drove men mad with lust. She bounced between relationships like a pinball, juggling multiple lovers while descending into alcoholism. One studio executive said Barbara had the morals of a tomcat, while gossip columnists dubbed her the girl who couldn't say no. Even after her star faded, She continued to appear in tabloids, often drunk, beaten, or half-naked. By the late 1950s, she had resorted to sex work and panhandling in Hollywood, her once glamorous life reduced to tragedy. She died of heart and liver failure at just 39. Her downfall became a parable, one that blamed her sexuality, rather than the men and machine that used her. Barbara Payton's story wasn't just about lust. It was about a woman who was labeled, punished, and ultimately destroyed for refusing to be ashamed of her desires. Bette Davis. Bette Davis didn't wear sex on her sleeve like other stars. But don't be fooled. Beneath that clipped speech, arched brows, and sharp wit was a woman whose passions ran deep, intense, and dangerously obsessive. She was no pinup, but she seduced with power, intelligence, and emotional volatility. To the press, she was simply difficult. To those who knew her, she was relentless, in art, in life, and in love. She married 4 times and had many more relationships. Some kept private, others exploding into very public disasters. Bette didn't seek lovers for comfort. She craved intensity. When she was in love, she threw herself in completely. She reportedly had an affair with William Wyler during Jezebel and often pursued married or unavailable men. Many insiders described her as emotionally ravenous, a woman who demanded complete devotion or nothing at all. What fueled the gossip was her ferocity. She didn't care about being seen as ladylike. Her relationships were full of shouting matches, jealousy, and passionate reconciliations. One ex-lover said Davis consumed people, both emotionally and sexually, which may explain why so many men were drawn to and burned by her. Studio executives were uneasy about Bette's off-screen fire. She defied traditional roles, didn't pretend to be meek, and often battled producers in public. But behind closed doors, rumors swirled. Some said Davis had romantic flings with women in her younger years. Others claimed her drive for intimacy stemmed from a complicated childhood, where affection had to be fought for. Perhaps her most honest confession came when she admitted, "Without wonder and insight, acting is just a trade. With it, it becomes creation." The same could be said of her love life. There was nothing transactional about it. It was all-consuming, creative, chaotic. While the tabloids didn't label her a nympho as brazenly as others, industry insiders certainly did, framing her emotional and sexual needs as dangerous. But Davis never apologized. She didn't just play complicated women, she was one. And in a town built on illusion, Bette Davis lived without shame, even if it meant being called something ugly by those too afraid of a woman who wanted too much. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich didn't just play seductresses, she lived as one. She floated through Hollywood like a phantom in silk and cigarette smoke, a bisexual enigma wrapped in diamonds and secrets. While other actresses were still being molded into obedient studio creations, Marlene wrote her own rules and her own lover's list. She was married to one man for most of her life, Rudolph Sieber, but the marriage was open, almost symbolic. While she never divorced him, Dietrich indulged in a parade of affairs with both men and women, actors, directors, royalty, even military generals. Gary Cooper, John Wayne, James Stewart, Edith Piaf, and Mercedes d'Acosta were just a few names whispered in her long trail of conquests. Insiders said she kept a little black book of lovers, each ranked by performance. She once joked that she didn't smoke after sex, because that would have meant taking a break. Some claimed she was insatiable, needing constant stimulation, not just physically, but emotionally. Dietrich's daughter Maria wrote that her mother used sex as a way of control, keeping powerful men like Josef von Sternberg wrapped around her finger. What made Marlene so terrifying to the Hollywood elite was her refusal to hide. She wore tuxedos and kissed women in public during a time when it could have ended her career. She performed for soldiers during World War II with a sultry flair that left men obsessed and women curious. To conservative America, she was an immoral figure. To Hollywood, a woman to both revere and fear. Studio heads couldn't rein her in, but they tried. Behind the scenes, producers discussed how to market a nymphomaniac without scandal. But Marlene outwitted them all. She cultivated her image with surgical precision, half myth, half confession. She once said, I do not think we have the right to judge anyone, and she lived by that mantra. Dietrich didn't care if they called her depraved, lascivious, or a nympho. Her lovers weren't conquests. They were chapters in a story written entirely by her, Carole Lombard. Carole Lombard was Hollywood's queen of screwball comedy, a dazzling mix of sass, brains, and unfiltered candor. But behind her rapid-fire wit and infectious laugh was a woman with a secret that the studio PR machines could never quite pin down. Carole loved sex, and she wasn't afraid to say it. In an era when most actresses were trained to act coy, Lombard made lewd jokes, bragged about her libido, and even wore a necklace that read "Fiuarari" under her gown at premieres, just for her own amusement. Born into wealth but raised with grit, Lombard didn't need validation from men. She just enjoyed them. Her lovers reportedly included Clark Gable, Russ Columbo, George Raft, and several behind-the-scenes Hollywood power players. Even before her marriage to Gable, she was known to openly discuss her affairs in private gatherings, refusing to hide behind demure, studio-engineered romance stories. What made Carole different wasn't just her appetite, it was her defiance of shame. She turned the stereotype of the nympho on its head. To her, sexuality wasn't taboo. It was joy, fun, freedom. Friends described her as a woman who took men like cocktails, one to start the evening and maybe another before dinner. And yet she was fiercely loyal in love, particularly to Gable. Their marriage was passionate, explosive, and filled with physical chemistry that spilled into public view. Still, even during her marriage, rumors swirled that Carole kept private trysts with past flames and male companions when Clark was away on set. Some close to the couple claimed their relationship thrived on that unspoken understanding, one not based in monogamy, but mutual trust and lust. Carole's life was cut tragically short in a 1942 plane crash while returning from a war bond tour. At just 33, she left behind a legend and a mystery. Had she lived longer, would Hollywood have forced her to settle, to suppress that part of herself that defied every feminine stereotype? Or would she have continued blazing her own hilarious, hedonistic trail? In the end, Carole Lombard didn't care what they called her, nympho, wild child, or rebel. She simply called herself free. Gloria Grahame. Gloria Grahame was the femme fatale who blurred the line between danger and desire. With her pouty lips, whispery voice, and smoldering eyes, she lit up post-war noir films like The Big Heat and In a Lonely Place. But off-screen, her life was even more scandalous. So scandalous that Hollywood began whispering not just about her sex life, but about her sanity. Married 4 times, including to director Nicholas Ray, Gloria had an undeniable magnetism that drew men to her like moths to a flame. But it was the affair that erupted into tabloid chaos that sealed her infamous status. Her relationship with Tony Ray, Nicholas Ray's own teenage son. Though their romance began after her divorce from Nicholas, rumors swirled that it had started when Tony was just a teenager and Gloria was still his stepmother. When she married Tony years later and had children with him, it didn't matter that it may have been legal. The press branded her a sexual deviant. Hollywood's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Graham's roles dried up. She was quietly blacklisted, not for politics, but for passion. But this wasn't Gloria's first taste of being called a nympho. Directors like Cecil B. DeMille reportedly found her too intense for leading roles, citing her flirtatious behavior in disregard for boundaries. Colleagues whispered that Gloria lived for desire, often falling in and out of bed with co-stars, producers, even crew members. Yet Gloria's sexuality wasn't chaos, it was a coping mechanism. Biographers suggest she battled with deep insecurity about her looks, obsessing over her upper lip to the point of multiple botched surgeries. Some say she used sex as validation, a way to quiet the inner voices that told her she wasn't enough. Gloria Grahame died in 1981, alone and virtually forgotten, after hiding a terminal illness from her family and friends. But her story remains one of old Hollywood's most tragic and most misunderstood. She wasn't reckless, she was just real. And in an industry built on illusions, truth was often the most dangerous thing of all. Zsa Zsa Gabor. Zsa Zsa Gabor didn't just live in excess, she made excess her brand. With 9 marriages, countless affairs, and an attitude that dripped with theatrical seduction, she became the face of unapologetic femininity. "I am a marvelous housekeeper," she once joked. "Every time I leave a man, I keep his house." It was more than a quip, it was a declaration. Zsa Zsa used charm, wit, and sex as tools of power in a world that wanted women to be grateful just to be loved. The press adored her, the tabloids even more so. Stories of Gabor betting royalty, magnates, actors, and artists filled gossip columns. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her unabashed hunger for romance and luxury that shocked Hollywood insiders. While others played coy, Zsa Zsa owned it. She married a Hilton and divorced him. She slapped a cop and called it self-expression. She seduced with her Hungarian lilt and left lovers breathless and broke. But for every admirer, there were critics. Many insiders whispered that Gabor's endless pursuit of pleasure was more than flirtation. It was compulsion. She was frequently labeled a nymphomaniac in industry circles, especially after scandalous claims from ex-husbands who painted her as insatiable and restless. Yet Zsa Zsa brushed it off with a diamond-studded shrug. Sex? I only use it when I want to get something. But underneath her glittering persona was a woman shaped by war, exile, and trauma. Born in Budapest, Zsa Zsa fled Europe during World War II, carrying scars that no amount of money or mink could erase. Some biographers believe her romantic compulsions were rooted in a need for safety, adoration, and above all, control. Zsa Zsa Gabor wasn't just a socialite or a scandalous actress. She was an icon who built her identity out of defiance. If that made her a nympho in the eyes of a judgmental world, then so be it. For her, indulgence wasn't shameful, it was survival. Peg Entwistle. Peg Entwistle's name is often remembered only in tragedy. The 24-year-old starlet who leapt from the H of the Hollywood sign in 1932 became a symbol of broken dreams. But lost in that legend is the story of a young woman whose need for intimacy, and perhaps validation, drove her into risky entanglements that later contributed to her downfall. Before her tragic death, Peg had built a promising reputation in theater. Her stage presence was electric, and casting agents saw something magnetic in her. But when she transitioned to Hollywood, things changed. She was quickly typecast, then quietly passed over. Friends later said she began turning to relationships to fill the growing void inside her. In a town that rewarded beauty but punished neediness, Peg's vulnerability became her undoing. Rumors circulated that she'd had affairs with multiple studio men, some of them married. Others claimed she often entered relationships that offered more harm than help, falling for men who could promise roles or recognition, but offered neither. Whispers of sexual desperation, fueled by industry gossip, began to cloud her reputation. Some even branded her a nympho in cruel, hushed tones, suggesting that her ambition was driven by bedroom transactions rather than talent. But Peg wasn't reckless. She was lost. Abandoned by her father, married briefly to a controlling actor who allegedly mistreated her, and increasingly sidelined by the system, she found herself spiraling. Her sexuality was never a weapon. It was a cry for affection in a city that devours its dreamers. Her suicide letter famously read, "I am afraid I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain." It was the final note of a young woman branded and broken, not for who she truly was, but for what the industry projected onto her. Linda Darnell. Linda Darnell was once called the girl with the perfect face. With her porcelain skin and haunting gaze, she dazzled in films like Forever Amber and A Letter to Three Wives. But behind the screen was a woman so plagued by insecurity and emotional need that it spilled into her relationships, transforming her from rising star to cautionary tale. Darnell entered the studio system as a teenager, groomed by 20th Century Fox to become the next big thing. But as she aged out of ingenue roles, anxiety set in. She feared fading into irrelevance, and so she sought validation where she could find it. Friends described her as desperate to be loved, and this desperation manifested in a string of turbulent affairs. Directors, actors, producers, Linda cycled through them, each relationship more intense than the last. She married 3 times and was often unfaithful, sometimes juggling multiple lovers. Industry insiders began labeling her emotionally unstable and, more quietly, a nymphomaniac. One producer famously claimed she needed love like others needed oxygen. If she didn't have someone, she fell apart. By the early 1950s, Darnell was battling alcoholism and career decline. She blamed herself and her heart that always wanted more. Tragically, in 1965, she died in a house fire at age 41 while staying with her former secretary. Ironically, she had been watching one of her old movies on television just before the blaze. Linda Darnell didn't suffer from too much desire. She suffered from too little peace. Her story wasn't about promiscuity. It was about a woman who believed love could save her. In a way, being labeled a nympho was just Hollywood's cruel shorthand for what it couldn't understand, an open heart in a closed world. These women weren't deviant, they were daring. Their stories reveal how Hollywood punished women for being passionate, powerful, and unafraid. Branded with shameful labels, they lit the screen and the world on fire. Now it's time to remember them not for the rumors, but for their strength, complexity, and unyielding spirit.